Hello, good evening, and welcome to The Game is About Glory. My name is Steff, and joining me are Gareth and Milo. Hello, chaps.
Evening.
Evening.
Well, all right, lads. With the Antonio steam train momentarily halted by the international break, we thought it would be a great time to take a look back at an era which, in many rather uncomfortable ways, could be said to capture the true spirit of what modern-day Tottenham have been all about. The 90s. Highs, lows, absurdities and dramas all took their part in a decade where the threat of greatness was getting real until it really wasn't anymore. So stay tuned as we'll bring you from Stewie to Dozy to Foxy and Super Steff, not me, the other one, and a few other names in between. But before all that, let's kick off the pod with this week's intro question. And chaps, if you could change one non-Spurs result in history, which one would you choose? Milo, let's go to you first.
So I'm going to go for the 2012 Champions League final, which was Bayern Munich 1, Chelsea 1, which Chelsea won 4-3 on penalties, and absolutely robbed them. So really, it's not just a Spurs thing. It's not just us getting back in the Champions League the following season and us signing Hazard that summer. It's also righting a wrong, because Chelsea didn't deserve to do that. They were awful during that time. Really, really dull, really defensive. And it's got some painful memories for me. I was in the Czech Republic when that game was on, and at my mother-in-law's house, and it was a lovely summer evening, and the windows were open. I was watching the football, and Petr Cech, being a bit of a national hero there, as Chelsea won on penalties, I could hear the neighbours cheering and shouting while I was kicking things around the house and generally being very grumpy. So, yeah.
How did your mother-in-law feel about that? You weren't kicking her stuff around the house, I hope.
I don't. I think I was on my own. I don't think anyone else was around.
You very quickly cleaned up the crockery that you smashed. Did you?
I'm not good company when I'm watching football. Generally, I don't talk to anyone. I kind of stare intently at the TV screen and mumble under my breath. So I'm not good football company.
Very good. All right, Gareth.
Yeah, it's obviously another painful memory. No real direct impact on Spurs here, but it's the game at Anfield on the 26th of May 1989, when all Liverpool had to do was avoid losing at home to Arsenal by 2 goals to secure another league championship at the expense of Arsenal. And I watched it as an 8-year-old and was convinced that, of course, Liverpool won't lose 2-0 at home. Liverpool never lose at Anfield anyway, let alone by 2 goals. So every time I've watched that goal since, I'm sure one of those occasions Grobbelaar's going to get a hand on it and it's going to go past the post and Arsenal won't score that second goal. But it was the catalyst for what was an incredible era for Arsenal going into the 90s, and I can remember going into school on the Monday morning really with my tail between my legs amidst a whole group of joyous Arsenal supporters, and that whole generation of Nick Hornby middle class Arsenal fans as well was born out of that night.
I was going to say an added benefit of that would be no Nick Hornby and his bloody awful imitators.
Absolutely. So, yes.
See, well, this is a conversation for another time. I actually have to say, Nick Hornby's actually a really good bloke. So I'm not having that. I think he's a really good bloke. And I actually hate to say it, I think Fever Pitch is an excellent book. The only problem is it's about the wrong football club. But if you can take the club out of it, I think it's an excellent book. I've had the pleasure of spending time with him on a few occasions, and not just a passing hello. He's like, good long conversations, and he's all right. So I've got I admit, choice of football club, awful.
I've got to confess, I've never been able to bring myself to read the book or watch the film.
Likewise, yeah.
Well, the film is off limits. I mean, but the book's really well written.
I've also got a bit of a thing against him because of High Fidelity as well. I'm a kind of avid record collector, and I
knew it.
Lots and lots of people have bought me High Fidelity over the years, and I'm not that kind of record. It just winds me up. So his first 2 kind of notable books just went off on the wrong angle for me.
I gotcha. Yeah, and I agree with the imitators thing. I think there've been a lot of painful imitate. Actually, it's not been very good. But I will recommend. I've got to recommend this for everyone. Actually, we're an international break. We can get a little lyrical here and wax off a bit about things that are non-football for a second. But if you want a great book about record nerds, or music nerds, I should say, Magnus Mill's The Forensic Records Society is an absolutely brilliant book. And Milo, if you don't like this book, I will pay for it. As a matter of fact, I will send it to you ahead of time because I think it's that good and I think you'll love it.
So we're doing the Game Is About Glory book club. Is this where we're starting?
Yeah, pipe and slippers coming next. It's like, oh dear. anyone got a 12-year single malt on the shelf? Maybe we should just get the cigars out. No, I'll bring you to my game. Let me. Very good man. Yeah, good old single malt. Man. As every good Tottenham Hotspur supporting house should have. Indeed, every good house. Anyway, regardless, let me dial us back to the game whose result I would change that is non-Spurs. It has absolutely nothing to do with Tottenham. It has to do with what I think is probably one of the very greatest football sides I've ever seen in my life. It's the 1982 Brazil with Socrates, Falcao and the like. And it is the game they played against Italy in the World Cup. Italy won 3-2. Paolo Rossi, as some of you older listeners may or may not remember, had been in jail actually on some sort of corruption charge. I can't quite remember which, and sort of come back for this tournament. And this was the game where he really started to get motoring for Italy. You know, no disrespect to Italy because obviously they were a great side. They ended up winning the World Cup that year, and you know they played really well in this game. But that Brazil was beautiful, and they reflected everything that Spurs were in many ways. Just you know, they played the game like they were poets. And Socrates is still, I think, one of the most astounding footballers I've ever seen. And I saw him live. I saw it when Brazil came to play England in a friendly, and it really was not just for me, for my friends. We all said the same. The World Cup in 1982 died considerably when Brazil lost that game, and it was ironic because England was still in the tournament at that time. We would get knocked out, you know, I think later that night actually, the way the games turned out. However, if you've never seen that game, I encourage you to look it up on YouTube. And I know that most people don't like to look up grainy footage. You know, it's so troublesome in these days of HD. But do it. It's worth your time because it's an absolutely superb game of football. And you'll truly see why the game is about glory for all of us. And the symmetry between that Spurs of 1982 and Brazil of 1982 was huge. Right down to the fact that neither of them fucking actually won the top titles that they should have got. So... yeah, I mean, should we spend a whole pod talking about that game? Probably not. Because it's time now to look back at the week that was. And speaking of the 80s and 90s, well, not the 90s, obviously, but the 80s, we just have been, or I have been, safe standing. Yes, standing. You'll be able to stand at football matches again without a steward, telling you to sit down. Be no steward telling you, because on Monday, the club announced that it's been successful in its licence application for safe standing from the 1st of January 2022. We join Cardiff City, Chelsea, Manchester City, Manchester United in the pilot scheme, which will see standing in the top 2 tiers of English football for the first time in nearly 30 years. And just to clarify, that's the top 2 tiers of English football, not the top 2 tiers of every stand at these clubs. Milo and Gareth, guys, what do we think? Are we excited about this?
Yeah, I mean, look, I personally would prefer to sit down than stand up, but I think it's really good. I think it's really good signs of progress from a safety and from a technology perspective that these things are possible. I think it's great that the club are at the forefront, and I think they used the phrase future-proofed when the stadium designs were first put in several years ago now, because they wanted to be the first to do that. I'm just about old enough to remember standing on the Paxton Road end for £3 back in the probably back in very early 90s actually, which we'll come on to. But yeah, look, I think it's a really good thing. I think that lots of the very important safety issues, and of course there was a huge major safety issue that caused standing to be banned in the first place. I think a lot of those objections have probably been overcome now, so I think it's a really good thing.
Yeah, I think it's excellent, and this has been a fan-led campaign that when it started, I think most of us thought it had no chance of succeeding, and it's really, really, really good that we've got to this point. Let's hope that the pilot is successful and we can see it introduced in more grounds as they're able to adapt them to safely accommodate standing within the grounds. The atmosphere is going to be fantastic, isn't it? It's going to be great. Let's hope we get an FA Cup game at home for the first weekend in January.
I agree, and I think one of the things, remembering the good old bad old days of standing very well, I think one of the things I like about the new initiatives is that you're going to get all the fun of standing without the overcrowding. I mean, it's not going to be overcrowded. It is going to be well spaced. It won't be spaced out massively, but it will not be like it was before.
It's 1-for-1 at the moment. So basically, yes. All that's happening is that your seat is going to be bolted into position.
Yeah.
So you're standing up. So anyone who thinks this is going to lead to cheaper tickets is kidding themselves. It's going to be the same price as it is now. That's not going to change because it's not going to increase capacity. But hopefully, it'd be great over time if we could get to the point where it was kind of 1.5 per seat. So once you've proved it's safe, maybe you can fit a few more people in. Then over time maybe that'll happen, but it's not going to see a drop in prices.
No, but what it will see is us dropping that stupid song "Stand Up If You Hate This" and "Stand Up If You Love That." Possibly the most annoying song. I mean, so it's just like, oh, really? So if nothing else, Safe Standing will surely see the end of those stupid songs. So I'm glad for that. Yeah, I agree. Exciting stuff. Earlier today, our women's side got a well-earned draw against Arsenal in the North London derby. We took the lead in the 65th minute through Rachel Williams, which is our first ever goal in a women's North London derby. Arsenal sadly snatched a draw in the second minute of added time, just to show that the pain of a last-minute goal carries through the club's DNA. Oh, God, I can't say that DNA thing. I didn't. Anyway, you can see the joke I'm trying to crack. I won't go there. Milo, why don't you talk a little bit about the women's team, because I know that you keep good tabs on them.
Yeah, I mean, just on the game generally, I think there's been some dogged defending for up until that 65th minute goal, and Neville had a chance shortly after that to make it 2-0, which is she shot over from just inside the area, which was a real shame because we were good value once we got the goal. I just think the side have made staggering progress. This is only our third year in the top flight of in the Women's Super League, and we're currently third in the league and in the last Champions League position. That's at the time of recording. I think Brighton can go above us if they win this weekend. And I think Conte isn't the only brilliant appointment we've made recently. Rhiannon Skinner has done an absolutely fantastic job since coming in November last year. And you think about in the summer, we let go of a lot of players. There was a really, 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 we talk about painful rebuilds. There was a really painful rebuild with the women's side this summer, and for them to hit the ground running and perform as they are is remarkable. They deserve all the praise they get. They're really playing well this year.
Yeah, I saw them play. They played Birmingham at the main stadium back in September, and I think it's really interesting to see that there's that they've got the Canadian captain who plays at centre half, who's the captain for Spurs as well, Shalina Zadorsky, and she just looks a level above, I say, everyone. I don't mean that detrimentally to the rest of the players. That was genuine world class experience that's gone into the very heart of the team, and she seems to have been having a really strong influence across the rest of the players. But I think what I've noticed is that they've started to look more technically capable this season. I still think probably the default position is that they go into these games against the likes of Arsenal and Manchester City, who actually we beat earlier in the year, and Chelsea, with a slight inferiority complex. I get the feeling that they think, well, let's try and defend and not lose before we go out and win. But that will come, and there's a really good. I mean, I've seen the area. They've got their own area at the training ground now. They've got their own pitch over there. Things are really, really moving. It's on a really, really nice trajectory. And I think that if anyone's just following Spurs women's results from afar, well, I think we'll be pleasantly surprised over the next few years, just to see that the line that they're on will continue to go upwards.
Excellent. Very good. All right. Thanks, chaps. Yes, I suppose actually, and it's not in the notes, but I mean, we should note that Harry Kane, having come out and, made comments in the press about not being fully at the races, mentally, physically, so on and so forth, and whatnot, and whatever little word I can come up with. Well, anyway, he turned around and he then, smashed a hat-trick in the international.
And I think it makes him England's all-time record goal scorer in competitive games.
Does indeed.
And in touching distance of pretty much all the other records now. He'll clear that within the year, won't he?
Okay, thanks, chaps. Right, let's get to it. Spurs in the 90s. I just actually tried to put together some sort of waxing preamble about what Spurs in the 90s was, and I realised as I was talking to Milo and Gareth that it was just a load of cobblers, because you can't couch it in any way, really. It was such a bizarre decade that we're just going to dive right into it, and we're going to dive in with the opening question, which is, what was it like being a Spurs fan for you in the 90s, Gareth?
Do you know what? The Spurs in the 90s, it's such a rich genre of Spurs nostalgia. I mean, I'm so happy when I heard that this was the theme of the pod this week. I mean, I was 9 years old in 1990, so my account is through the prism of, obviously started as a 9-year-old and went through my teens as a Spurs fan as well. Looking back on it, it was such a sort of clusterfuck of a decade, wasn't it? Because every season seemed completely disconnected to the one before it and the one after it. So whereas now we're in our parlance around projects and building towards something, well, I think as we'll go on to discuss, maybe the first couple of years under Terry Venables, it felt like there was a plan in place. But from that point onwards, for various reasons, you just go the huge peaks and troughs that you'd go from 12-month to 12-month period was incredible. But look, we had some amazing, genuine world-class players for the club in the moment, but they were a very, very small minority. There was a hell of a lot of mediocrity in the 90s, both in the dugouts and on the pitch. And I think you can look back at it with some nostalgia now, and it's quite fun to look back on. But it's important. So a lot of people listening to this at the moment may be fairly new to Spurs, and often you'll hear on a variety of different podcasts when we go on a 3-game streak where we don't win, someone will come out and say that it's not as bad as supporting Spurs in the 90s. So I think this is why we're talking about it, isn't it? It's to really give some substance to that sort of that sort of cliche about Spurs in the 90s. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to the things we're going to discuss for the rest of this pod.
I'm not. I hated the 90s. It was awful. We were bloody awful. And Gareth's absolutely right. We did have some fantastic players, but more often than not, we'd have one, if we were lucky, 2 good players surrounded by absolute crap. And as the decade goes on, it's a slide into mediocrity. So the decade starts well. It's a slide into mediocrity that took us 15 years to recover from. And I'm thankful that Sugar saved us from bankruptcy, but that's it. The way he ran the club was awful. So that's it.
Well, thank you for that balanced retrospective. Always good to have a rational point of view on the game is about glory. Oh, great. So good. I'm going to split the difference and say that for me, it was constant Jekyll and Hyde, Jekyll and Hyde decade. I mean, from pony kits, quite literally, to, one of the greatest away shirts we ever produced in 1994-95, from, teams of enormous excitement, same 1994-95, to teams of stupefying boredom. And I'm thinking of like 1998, 99, the pony years. It really was, as you say, Gareth, a bouncing ball. You never quite knew where you were. And yes, Milo, 100%, and we'll get into this, thank you, Alan Sugar, for saving us from Captain Bob Maxwell, which would have been a possibly greater disaster. Mm-hmm. But no thank you for the way that you actually managed to manipulate the club and squeeze it like a tea bag. Actually, I would never want a cup of tea from Alan Sugar because he'd used the same bag 6 times, and you wouldn't get any biscuits, which we'll get into later. But there was a time where he actually eliminated biscuits from the morning tea round, as I understand it, in emphasis. So yes, it was a bouncing ball, wasn't it? It was all over the place, and we never really knew where we were going. And the S word has been brought up. He bought the club in 1991. When I say the S word, I mean Alan Sugar. He bought the club in 1991, and how much of this discussion is actually a discussion about his stewardship of the club? Because, he did set the tone, didn't he? It's very true. And he maintained the tone for much of the decade. And, Gareth, I'm going to ask you to start first, because we can't have the level of just, parity and common sense and that Milo's been displaying already. We can't have that. We've got to get a little irrational here. So I'm looking to you for some irrational opinion, Gareth.
Yeah, you're talking to someone who, as a 12-year-old, went outside the then trading ground in Mill Hill with an A4 bit of paper with Sugar Out written on it once he'd sacked Terry Venables. So I very much lived through this era.
And you have risen to the challenge.
And I've risen to the challenge.
Trumped. We've all been trumped. Fantastic. Gareth, you legend. Great.
I've got a slightly revised version of thoughts on Alan Sugar now, but Milo, you fairly flippantly said, Alan Sugar, you saved us from bankruptcy, but so what? That's a bit like, so Mr. Lincoln, how was your trip to the theatre otherwise? It's there's
the dark horse is riding amok in the pod. Brilliant.
He's the main protagonist in the Spurs decade of the 90s, Alan Sugar, without a doubt. And I don't say he splits opinion, because I think probably the opinion is about 20% of him are sort of quite like him, and 80% of the Spurs fans think is the Antichrist. But you can't deny the fact that without his intervention, which financial intervention, who knows what would have happened to us. We may well have been playing in second, third tier of English football had he not been involved. As you said, Robert Maxwell had been involved, it would have been an unmitigated disaster. However, he wanted to run the club as he ran his business empire. He wanted to do things. He's not quite like Mike Ashley, but it's probably the best for someone recently sort of following the game. He's probably the best example you can give that he really didn't want to invest a great deal of money into the club, and he hoped that he would find coaches ultimately that would turn rocks into diamonds.
Yeah, I think that's fair, isn't it? I mean, he famously said that he wanted to run the club like Wimbledon. And you're absolutely right. I think Ashley's probably the closest. I mean, he did put money in to begin with to save us from bankruptcy. But after that kind of initial period, it was cost cutting and scrimping, and transfer business was pretty poor on the whole, wasn't it? And I was just going to jump ahead to the kind of the reaction to the Klinsmann, Klinsmann leaving and the Carlos kicker ball.
Yeah.
Before we get to that, I do want to add. I think that yes, Mike Ashley with a bit of Mike Reid in him as well. I think if he remembers Mike Reid, because he had a mouth on him like Mike Reid did, albeit not quite the same accent. He certainly always enjoyed the limelight. But I think actually for me, one thing with Sugar that's very important to sort of divine is that when Terry Venables was at the club working with him, Sugar was uncomfortably okay with Venables being the face of the club. And as that was happening, we did actually see a few good deals go down. I mean, we did see Teddy Sheringham came in from Nottingham Forest, which was undoubtedly an excellent acquisition for us. And you felt that we were okay, because Venables, of course, is such a personable and somewhat erudite, actually, spokesperson for the club. But of course, the problem started once Vena's sort of, I don't want to get into any sticky language here, but let's just say didn't behave properly and was found out to have not done so as such. And I think Sugar at that point, for me personally, I don't know how you feel, at that point, this sort of like, dental floss line of trust that he had in letting a spokesperson go ahead of him. He's like, right, fuck this. I can never let this happen again. I'll never let anyone be like that. And it feels like after that, it was always like, well, whoever it is going to be under me.
Yeah.
And that's when he truly imposed himself. Does that feel about right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think when Sugar came in, he was a bit green and relied on Venables. And of course, Venables was at the club before Sugar and was involved in bringing him in. And I think Venables' plan at that time was, I think he mistakenly thought that Sugar might be a silent partner in this and he'd be left to run the football club. But of course, when the messy fallout, when they fell out over how Venables was acting, I think Sugar reacted to that and became probably his natural self, a complete control freak, and he ran the club like a budget computer manufacturer, which was his experience prior to that.
I remember reading Sugar's autobiography that probably was written about 10 years ago, but he speaks about those early times when he came in to the club. And he said, sort of, firstly, the first few home games, he'd been sitting in the block next to the director's box, unknowingly, and someone said to him, well, you put £11 million in, why are you sitting over there? And the director's box was full of Venables and all his people in there. Sugar also talks about the complete chaos that the way that the club was run. He said that he observed a player one day just pulled into the car park after training, went to the back of the club shop, opened his boot and got people from the club shop just to throw loads of kit and merchandise in there. And when he questioned it, that's just what the players did if they wanted to do it. So there was no stock control. And you can imagine from someone from Sugar's perspective who you'd like to micromanage and count all the beans.
The flip side of that is, and I won't name player, but I know a player who, when they joined the club, was so appalled at the fitness facilities that said, I cannot do this. I have, I need a membership for a David Lloyd's gym because this is just not professional. And he got it because even Sugar couldn't disagree with that. So, I mean, we did cut corners in some pretty weird places, and we're back to the fabled tea and biscuits thing, which at one point the rumour goes that he cut biscuits for the morning 11s that used to go around the club offices. I mean, he was quite legendary for finding a way to pinch a penny, and I think it's fair to say, and we should probably touch on this now, it's fair to say it probably cost us a few players along the way. Would we not agree?
Well, I mean, I think it did. I mean, perhaps in Sugar's defence, he'll say that he spent $4.5 million on Rolf Fox and Chris Armstrong. When $4.5 million didn't sound like a lot of money, but I think in the mid-90s it did. He then spent £6 million on Les Ferdinand. So there is evidence that money was spent there, perhaps not very, very wisely was the problem. But yeah, I think the problem was that he just didn't see what was happening elsewhere in football, that he wasn't an innovator at all. So at the time when Arsenal were going out and appointing Wenger and Chelsea were bringing in foreign players, he, because of the Klinsmann episode, he had a real fear and loathing, I think, and reticence to go and sign continental players. Whereas we can see in hindsight now that was the direction English football was going in at the time. So the teams that succeeded were innovators. They were embracing some of the continental ideas that came across, and we did it as a reaction, and then we did it badly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think kind of their reactionary point is a key one. If you look at Christian Kroos as an appointment, that looks, almost entirely as an attempt to try and mirror what Arsenal were doing with Wenger and just getting it badly, badly wrong. And, you say about, the Klinsmann fallout from that. Well, the fallout from that was us missing out on Bergkamp.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, look, I will share a little more sort of football gossip, if you will, that I came into at the time. At the 1994 World Cup here in the US, I happened to run into Sir Alex Ferguson after Brazil's opening game. He was actually over with the Scottish Football Association. I think he was also scouting Mauro Silva, actually, for Man United, who would have been a great signing. Would have been a great signing for us, actually. He saw my Spurs T-shirt. I asked him if he'd sell us Mark Hughes for what I'd give him some money for him. He said, "You'd like him, wouldn't you?" And I said, "Yeah, but I wouldn't want Paul Ince." And he said, "You'll never talk about Incey badly to me, young man." And he proceeded after that to actually buy me and my mate several drinks, and was just completely conversational for the next night, for the next hour or so. Really, really nice. Really loved. Well, I found him to be a really nice guy. Really enjoyed talking about football. But my word, he laid into Sugar. And this was the summer, of course, where we'd had the points deduction. That we'd had a 12-point deduction, and we were kicked out of the FA Cup. And he was all over it. But the thing I took away from it was, and it's something you just hinted at, Gareth, is that, Alan Sugar wasn't a football man. So he wasn't the sort of guy who could go and, have a sherry with his peer, or what I mean? That was not who he was. He was who he was. And you had to be him or not, or he wasn't going to talk to you. And Ferguson told me that it actually cost us, that when it came to dealing with Alan Sugar, other clubs didn't like it. They didn't like him. He was unpopular. And so it really did cost us, I think, in many, many ways.
Steph, I've got a theory that for Premier League managers, words got around about the cruel way that you treated Graham Souness, and that they're and they're overly nice to you because they're scared that you're going to give them a shove in the back when they're not paying attention, or just push them over.
Very true. That's Fergie was very, very quick when I went to buy him a drink. He was very quick to say, "No, lads, let me get them in," with one eye over his shoulder at all times, knowing my potential for bar shoving, as had become, as you're quite right, famous in the football world, actually internationally. So well spotted. Yeah.
When you talk about Sugar not being a football man, if you compare him to David Dine at Arsenal, and kind of the difference in terms of their tenure and what they managed to do for the club, and kind of their foresight about the way the game was going, and it couldn't be more marked.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Just thinking about everything I say on Sugar here just leads me to the conclusion that there's no binary conclusion to this. But I mean, actually, in 1994, we signed Klinsmann. We also signed Dumitrescu and Popescu at a time where there really weren't many foreign players in the Premier League, and we were innovators. I think Nottingham Forest signed Brian Roy that summer, but really those were the only foreign players in there. So it's almost as if we stumbled upon an innovation, and then because of what happened with Klinsmann, we then shat ourselves, or at least Sugar did anyway. But then if you look at the likes of Ruud Gullit, Dennis Bergkamp, Roberto Di Matteo, Juninho, Emerson, Vialli, David Ginola, that came into the Premier League in those next 2 years when we seemed, again, very reticent to go back into those markets. That's really what cost us.
Yeah.
It was false pride, wasn't it, really? And I mean, ultimately, we should also note that another probably vital moment in 90s Tottenham Hotspur history is that the one person who could have held as big a grudge as Alan Sugar was Jurgen Klinsmann, but he didn't. And he came back and saved us from relegation. I mean, this was after, I'm sure that you'll remember, Milo, some of the things that were said about Klinsmann, like, He said something about
Wouldn't wash his car with his shirt.
Yeah.
sort of thing that was exceptionally rude and unnecessary. But thankfully Jurgen didn't hold any grudges and came back and was a major factor in us staying up in 1997-98. But we sank into mid-table mediocrity in the 90s. There's absolutely no doubt about it, and that's probably quite a polite evaluation if you consider 97-98, to be fair. But we did this just when the Premier League, Champions League and Sky coverage of games was bringing in huge sums of money for successful clubs. And of course, the great irony is that Alan Sugar was one of the key drivers of the Premier League and Sky happening. But, how much did this, mediocrity cost us?
Well, can I just touch on kind of how that Premier League deal came about? So
yeah, you should, absolutely.
So in May 1992, the Premier League chairman were meeting in London to discuss the bids, and you had ITV, Sky B, so bidding for it, and Sugar, as Spurs chairman, had received an envelope that morning with containing the details of ITV's bid, and he picked up the phone to Sam Chisholm at Sky B and told him what ITV's bid was and told him to blow them out of the water. And the reason Sugar did this is that Amstrad were making Sky satellite dishes. So Sky did blow them out of the water. I think Sugar originally offered not to vote on the deal, but the Premier League allowed him to do so. And the Sky bid was accepted by 14 votes to 6. So Sugar's vote was crucial in giving it the 2/3 majority in order to pass. And as a result of that, Amstrad's share price jumped by £7 million on the announcement of the deal, which smells a little bit.
Oh, yeah. It smells like an open sewer on a hot summer's day.
So, if you look at the kind of the route that modern football's taken, Sugar was absolutely instrumental in setting the Premier League on that path. But we as a club didn't benefit on it because we during a decade where we started the decade in a good shape. We had a good team on the pitch. If there was a mess financially off it, but the team at the turn of the decade was a really, really good team. And when the Champions League started off, we weren't in a position to qualify. And as the number of places expanded, we missed out, and it became a bit of a cartel for a while. The top four clubs locked into those positions, or the top two, and as it expanded out, locked into those positions. We completely missed that. And because that money coming into the game, we were falling further and further behind clubs that at the turn of the decade were either our peers or clubs that were behind us.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, this is one of the reasons. And for those of you who do not remember this era of history, you will hopefully have a little better of an understanding why we're not, we don't get quite so jumpy in our chairs about the morals of super leagues and so on and so forth, because we saw the moral code sort of corrupted once already. And as you've just outlined, Alan Sugar was part of that whole movement. But how typically Tottenham is it that he's part of a movement that ushers this in, but then he, for whatever reason, I will personally state, I think his ego and the way he is, prevented us from benefiting, as you just said. How ironic indeed.
Yeah, only to say, I think had the Premier League and the football boom occurred 10 years earlier, we'd have really benefited from that in a big way. I think it really would have done a lot for our global brand. I think that equally Liverpool and Everton, of the traditional big five from the 80s, also were a little bit like us, that they weren't on the ascendancy at the right time either. And it took, you could arguably Everton have never caught up. Liverpool, it's probably taken them, they took them 30 years to win a league title again. Manchester United, Arsenal, and then Chelsea, for other reasons, were the main benefactors of that football boom that occurred. And so, unfortunately, we had the handbrake on at exactly the wrong time.
Probably only Arsenal and Man United who actually clued up to it. So the big five, us, Arsenal, Man United, Liverpool, Everton.
I think Man United were very fortunate as well to have had the right youth set up, at the same time as they could, so they didn't have to spend massive amounts of money. They could just make massive amounts of money and bank it. And
their timing was perfect. They won the first Premier League title. Bringing in Cantona at that point, just absolutely perfect timing.
So there's one other sort of slightly lesser known character who played a big part in that. So Spurs had a guy working for them somewhere in the commercial department. I think his name was Edward Freeman, who left the club in the early 90s to join Manchester United. And he is supposedly responsible for the commercialisation that Manchester United benefited from, that you just alluded to there. So, he was really the brains behind their club shop being essentially a shed and turning into the first megastore of any club in the world in the early 90s. So that, not quite sure the chronology of why he left Spurs, and I think it's perhaps in the latter years of the Scholar era.
Oh dear. You know what, Milo? You're right. It is actually all turning a bit shit after all, isn't it? When we look back.
It's the international break. Let's do a light, cheery one, I said.
Just looking at all the potential and all the moments. I mean, there's so many sliding doors. It's like an Eichler home. It's like unbelievable. I mean, anyway, look, I think we've established that Alan Sugar, again, thank you for saving us, but, we really wish you'd been a little different when it came to the, really putting your foot on the pedal. I think we've agreed with that. I would like to, before we, get to the playing staff in the 90s, I think we should touch very briefly on the managers. And I think, Ozzy, obviously. Then we had Jerry Francis, affectionately known, or I think it's affectionately known as the Badger, for his fantastic hair. Fantastic, I mean egregious in a way, one of the most egregious mullets, although consistent he has been with that mullet. You cannot deny him that. There was Christian Gross, and then there was Man in a Raincoat, whose name I still find it nearly impossible to say. And I mean, it's fair to say we ended the 90s with Man in a Raincoat and Stuart Houston as the number 1 and 2 in our club, which I think, quite frankly, to me, says everything about like how, absolutely terrible the 90s became by the end. But let's briefly look at Ozzy. We were talking about this before we came on the pod, and we were trying to debate and remember, whether the points deduction from the season he got sacked in 94, 95 came in, whether the points came back after he got sacked. And we determined that they did. So, I mean, let me just ask you a pointed question. We saw what Ozzy was trying to do with the famous 5. We saw how it really wasn't balanced enough to work very well at that time. You saw flickering embers of it working, but of course, with respect to Stuart Nethercott, when he's just, one of your centre halves, it's always going to be hard to make it solid. Yeah. Do we believe that had Ozzy been given a little more time and possibly had the points, that he would have got it right with, the likes of Dumitrescu and Klinsmann and Barmby and Anderton? I mean, there's a lot of good players there. And remember, he did sign in Gica Popescu, a quite brilliant footballer. And there's a player that got away. So do we think that, if we'd have stuck with him, it would have turned around or not? Gareth, I think I'm going to go to you first.
No, I'd love to think that it would have done, but I don't think it did, because prior to that season, we had the 93-94 season, which was his first year in charge. And you've got to remember that Ozzy being appointed was a reaction to Venables sacking and Sugar really needing to get in the fans on side. And Ozzy Ardiles had a very unremarkable managerial record at both Swindon, West Brom and Newcastle in the second or third tiers before that. So it was his name that he was brought in for. And we nearly got relegated in that 93-94 season, albeit because Teddy Sheringham, who was our best player, was out for a significant period of that year. I think we went on a 13-game streak of not winning in the Premier League from New Year's Day through until Easter Saturday. So I think there's enough evidence to suggest that Ozzy wasn't up to the job of keeping a team in the Premier League, let alone getting into the sort of the top 6. And we were a flash in the pan for the start of that 94-95 season because we had the front 5, and it took about 4 weeks for teams to work out how to play against us. And once they did, the writing was on the wall.
Yeah, I think you're both right. I think maybe Ozzy should have been director of football rather than first team manager. There's some great signings there, but he didn't quite know what to do with them.
We went from Ozzy, and by the way, I have to say, Gareth, I think you're probably right on reflection. And regular listeners to our pod will surely understand that I am a hopeless romantic who likes to believe that, the flowers and the trees and the birds and the animals speak to us all and hug us when we need them in our time of desperation. But life isn't quite like that, is it? And I think you're quite right. Ozzy probably wouldn't have worked out regardless. But the Badger came in, and it was quite exciting for a while. It certainly culminated in probably what was one of my favourite moments of the 90s, which we'll talk about a little later, I'm sure, the quarter-final victory at Anfield. There was some good stuff going on. Then we got to 96, and then we got to 97, and it was just all falling apart. It all fell apart again, didn't it? And then we got Christian Gross. So let's just have a few brief words on the Jerry Francis era for those who don't remember it, and also for those who do.
So Jerry Francis was appointed to replace Ozzy in '94 because of the work he'd done at Queen's Park Rangers. So he'd taken a very unremarkable side and got them punching above their weight. When he came to Spurs, obviously, so he had Klinsmann, he had Sheringham, he bombed Dumitrescu out fairly quickly and brought David Howells back in. Then, of course, he lost Klinsmann and Barnby through no fault of his own in the next summer. I mean, he built a very functional side. So the 95-96 side contained the likes of Dean Austin, Colin Calderwood, Justin Edinburgh, Jason Dezell, Ronnie Rosenthal. It was a very functional team with very ordinary players. The problem was it really had a ceiling. So although we did quite well that year and we finished just outside, and it was only on the last day of the season that we were denied finishing in the UEFA Cup, the 95-6 season. But the following year, Chris Armstrong and Teddy Sheringham both suffered really bad injuries. And the thing I remember most about Jerry Francis was just how unfortunate he seemed to be. He seemed to have a hell of a lot of bad luck, particularly with injuries, which perhaps may have been down through a lack of progression in the physical conditioning of players, and certainly the medical team at Spurs at the time. This isn't hyperbole. It was a joke, the Spurs medical team. You can hear lots of players who played in that era talking about some of the treatment they were given, some of the advice that they were given. I think Jerry Francis was just slightly a man out of time. I think we got him when he was perhaps at the peak of his powers at Queen's Park Rangers, but football moved on very quickly in that sort of 18 to 24 month period afterwards, and he was left badly behind.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think you could see the logic. He'd done well at QPR, comparatively, but I think probably what appealed to Sugar most was again him building a team on a budget rather than anything
polishing turds.
Yeah,
and I think we covered Christian Gross earlier. One of you very very accurately said, I think it was you, Milo, said he was essentially a reaction appointment to Arsene Wenger that was just horribly researched and horribly wrong. And I've got to admit I felt a certain sympathy for Christian Gross, because he made that comment about that using his travel card or whatever to get just of course the press at the time merciless. This was the cabbage era Sun, right? So they would jump on anything, and I think he was trying to make a what I would consider to be an inclusive proletariat comment, and it just shoved right back at him. And I also do think that he had the misfortune to stumble across several players who just didn't give a flying fuck. I think that was a massive problem as well. But, somehow we managed to stay up, and, we survived his tenure. And then we ended up with he who should not be named. And look, I'll go on record here right now as saying I had a ticket for that 1999 League Cup final, and I didn't go. And, I know people get upset about this sort of stuff. You support the club, not the... That's fine, support the club, but that man should never have been at our club. It's as simple as that. And if you disagree, then I disagree with you tenfold. And I thought it was a wanky appointment, and it was an even wankier appointment to bring in Stuart Houston, and it really made things unpleasant.
I mean, I think with George Graham, it's ironic. We were talking earlier on about the fallout from Sugar's falling out with Venables and the points deduction and what have you, and then his last appointment as Spurs chairman was George Graham, who'd served a ban for taking bungs, and not only what he'd done at Arsenal and how fucking god awful his football is. He'd served a ban. Just unbelievable.
Sorry, I'm slightly at risk here. I just want to check, Steff, there's no soapbox underneath you at the moment, is there? Because the similarities between the appointment of George Graham in 1998 and the appointment of Jose Mourinho in 2019 are startling, really. And it's it's another example of managers, even the very, very best managers, maybe except for Ferguson, who's the exception to this one, have a shelf life of about 10 years. George Graham went into an environment at Arsenal in 1986 where he had the ability and the capacity to build his team, unfortunately, and we mentioned the Anfield 89 game earlier, into a great team. By 1998, his time was up. Football had moved on, and Alan Sugar was appointing him on reputation, not on what was happening at the time.
So you only have to look at what David O'Leary did at Leeds after he left. Yeah, the difference between George Graham's Leeds side and David O'Leary's Leeds side, just, chalk and cheese.
Very well stated. And again, we've said this, I believe, on the pod before, but it bears saying right now. One thing that I think listeners should know if they don't is that, the man in the raincoat approached Tony Adams to be his assistant, and Adams basically turned around and said, "Absolutely not. I'd never go across there. No, I wouldn't do it. Won't happen." And for that, he will always have my grudging respect. good for him. Instead, the Bungmeister did take our money. And, it's a fine example of why I disagree with trophy wankers, actually, because a trophy from under his tenure doesn't count to me. And I know people would be upset about that. That's fine. We're all supporters in our own different ways and so on. I didn't stop. I still bought, the pony shirt that season. I still supported the club. I just, I could not say his name and don't like to acknowledge it. So
the fascinating thing about that season is that the undercard, or sort of the subtext of that George Graham era was Player of the Year David Ginola, who was playing for us that year. And that was like a play in itself, the clash of personalities and characters between them and what they stood for and who the crowd were behind.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's, we're into that whole period, and I think that we should take a little look at some of the players that, define 90s Spurs for us. And I mean, we've mentioned Ginola. I'll briefly say that, I think that one of the things that always sees Ginola get the plaudits for this decade and this era was he was a shining light in a shit show of darkness most of the time. I mean, erratic darkness at that. But he was a consistent reminder that the club still had someone who played with what we considered to be the Tottenham way, the Tottenham ethos.
Yeah, very. I mean, I'm still amazed that we got him in the first place because he was a star in the Newcastle side, and it was Dalglish that was prepared to release him in '97 when he came to us. So it was Jerry Francis that signs Ginola, and I'm not sure Francis ever really knew what to do with him, because in Francis' mind, Andy Sinton was his left winger, player that you could rely on, would track the right winger going back the other way. And I mean, Ginola sort of popped up all over the place in those first few months in that first season, and then again under Christian Gross, and he combined well with Klinsmann, and they were very much on the same wavelength. But yeah, what a player! My memories of watching Ginola play were when he picked the ball up on the halfway line, you would just hear that noise of seats flipping up and hitting the back of it because people were on their feet and they just wanted to see what he was going to do next. And we were so blessed to see him and to have him at the height of his power for those 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Pick a player, 2 if you want, that typify 90 Spurs for you. But let me just give our listeners, a list of players that we put together. I'll just read these outright. You've got Ian Walker, Justin Edinburgh, Teddy Sheringham, Darren Anderson, Nick Barmby, Eric Torsvit, Sol Campbell, David Howes, Ginola, Ferdinand, Klinsmann, Calderwood, Carr, Rosenthal, Fox, Sinton, Armstrong, Everson, Nielsen. Those are the ones we've named. And I'm about to name Stuart Nethercott for probably the 6th time in this podcast, which is probably 5.5 times more than either Gareth or Milo expected his name to pop.
I don't think his mum's called him that much in the last year, let alone.
No. And of course Austin and Sedgley, and I'm going to throw in that there was a point in time where we looked at Dean Austin and Justin Edinburgh as dashing attacking fullbacks, and they were recognised as such. But in order to keep this somewhat manageable for the listener and the editor, let's nail it down to players that that really for you would be a heartbeat of 90s top. Milo.
Just kick off with Darren Anderton. Up until very, very recently, our Premier League appearance record holder, an ever-present bar a couple of years at the beginning, and much maligned at the time, but a fantastic player, absolutely fantastic player, and a shining light pretty much through the decade.
What I really like about Darren Anderton, the signing of him, it's very much Daniel Levy a few years ago said about their comfort zone is buying players in that maybe 10 to 15 million pound who are young and can progress. And I mean that's what Darren Anderton was, albeit with inflation factored in as well. That we signed him for just over £1 million in 1992. It was Terry Venables that really made a beeline for him to get him away from Portsmouth, where he'd started in their cup run that had gotten to the semi-final. And there's a lot of revisionist history about Darren Anderton because of his nickname, but as you said there, he played more Premier League games for us than anyone else, and until Hugo surpassed that tally. And he played for us pretty much for 8 seasons during the 90s. He was a very, very good player, and technically he scored some fabulous goals. And the fact that players like Teddy Sheringham and Jurgen Klinsmann enjoyed playing with him so much has got to be a sign of how good a player he was. It really upsets me when I hear people providing a slightly revisionist version of his impact at the club. But I mean, slightly because he was the first player's name that I had on the back of my shirt. I will always very, very fondly remember Darren Anderson, and a huge part of England's Euro '96 team as well, and then Glenn Hoddle's 98 squad too.
Yeah, I was going to mention his international form appearances. He was excellent for England.
Well, I remember the debut. It was Terry Venables' first game as England manager when we played. It was a friendly against Denmark in 1994, and this was a time where it felt that players getting an international call-up was a huge thing. And I can remember kind of quite nervously watching that game against Denmark, really, really desperate for Darren Anderton to do well in that game, and he did, and he kept his place in the team, and he was, say, a big part of Venables' team and then of Glenn Hoddle's team that went through to 98.
Yeah, I agree with all of that when it comes to Darren Anderton, affectionately known as Shaggy. Note, again, listeners will surely figure out. Well, actually, listeners might not know why he was called Shaggy.
Scooby-Doo.
Zoinks!
That's right, Scooby-Doo. Scooby-Doo, that's right. So next time you watch Scooby-Doo, think of Darren Anderton. I'm going to actually go with someone, I mean, there's so many great names. And, I wanted to go with Teddy Sheringham in my heart of hearts, because Teddy Sheringham was my favourite player for Spurs during that time and scored what I consider to be one of the greatest goals I've ever seen live with the equaliser at Anfield. It was just beautiful. The curl and bend on that ball, it was just fantastic. But I'm going to actually be a little more holistic and look at the decade as a whole. And I think Justin Edinburgh has to be the player who, for me, he spanned pretty much the entire era.
His Spurs career was 1990 to 2000.
Yeah.
Right. So he saw it all. He saw all the highs, all the lows, all the irregularities. But one thing you could say about Justin Edinburgh and his 213 odd appearances, and I think there's probably a few more than that, cup games. One thing you'd say about him in all those appearances was he was pretty consistent. I mean, you knew what you were getting with him. You were getting commitment. You were getting a bloke who was not afraid to do his job. And he really did. I mean, as the cliches go, and I don't want to get too cliche-ridden here, but he would leave it all out there. I think one thing that always amuses me is that in all those appearances, he scored one goal. Where were you when Justin scored would probably be a song. And that goal was at Sheffield United in 1991 in a 2-2 draw. And he never scored other than that. I think probably is a very famous memory that everyone has. And this will be the game that I turned the ticket down for, actually, that I was talking about a little earlier. But I did see it on the telly. Admit to watching it on the telly. I couldn't completely blank it. But of course, he's dust up with Robbie Savage in the League Cup final, which almost actually, I think, sealed his legend in a way. I don't know why that was, but there was an outpouring of sympathy for him in the face of Savage's complete shithousery. But yeah, for me, he really does typify everything because, through thick or thin, fancy boys and none all around him, whoever's in charge, sugar this, whatever that, there he was. He was a stalwart. So he's sort of my 90s guy, I think, if we have to define anyone.
Yeah, no, I have very fond memories of him, God rest his soul, of course. But he's the only player that played for Spurs in every calendar year of the 90s. As you said, he joined us from Southend in 1990 and then left in 2000. My memory of Justin Edinburgh was it was a cup game against Nottingham Forest. It was one when we lost on penalties to them, and I don't know why I was sitting at the top of the East Stand that game, and it was just sort of a 20-80 challenge against him, and he must have run about 30 yards just to make this challenge, which would probably be a red card these days, but it was a fair challenge and it went out for a throw-in and nothing came of it. But that was just his tenacity and his enthusiasm to win the ball and to get the crowd going as well. So yeah, very fond memories of Justin Edinburgh. I'm going to go a little bit more irreverent, albeit he's a bit of a folklore hero. That's Alan Nilsson. Now Alan Nilsson, I would say, is just an example of that sort of bargain aisle European player that we bought whilst Arsenal and Chelsea were buying superstars. We were out getting players from Bromby for £1.5 million. And Alan Nilsson,
with exceptional teeth.
He did have very good teeth, yeah.
He had wonderful teeth, great bone structure, and he had highlights as well, didn't he?
I think there we go. We've touched on players here.
There we are. Of course we have to. Anyway.
Alan Nilsson will be remembered most famously for scoring that winner in the aforementioned game, of which the ticket still sits on your mantelpiece, Steff, against Leicester. And the greatest gift that he gave not only to Tottenham Hotspur but to football that afternoon was that by scoring that goal in the 92nd minute, it deprived everyone of watching another 30 minutes of extra time, which would have been god awful.
How true. How utterly true.
I remember Alan Nilsson's home debut. It was a league game against Newcastle, and this is really when this Newcastle were peak Newcastle, so they just bought Shearer for 15 million and probably in the same way that Gascoigne and Lineker used to add 5,000 people onto the gate in the early 90s, Newcastle had that same effect in the mid-90s. And I can remember watching Nielsen play in that game, and he got cautioned after about 7 minutes, and the bloke behind me had written him off at that point. And look, he was a very average but very hard-working player who played for us. But so I think he really epitomises our dabbles into the continental market, which was just opening up to English clubs at the time, and ultimately it was why we always finished somewhere between 9th and 13th.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I think we can refer to people to the list that I did read out at hyperspeed. I mean, we're overlooking some fantastic players. We're also, let's be blunt, we're also overlooking the fact that for several years we had the greatest young centre-back in English football, and whether anyone wants to admit it or not, Sol Campbell was a marvellous centre-back for several seasons. He was brilliant, and that's why it hurt so much what he did. And it's such a typical illustration of Spurs in the 90s that we can have, probably the best centre-back in world football and lose him to that lot across the street. But I mean, it should be mentioned, we get stick week in, week out, quite rightly so, for the way he went about his transfer, albeit I think we've defined that stick should remain on football terms and nothing else. But he was a great player. I mean, there's no two ways about it. And then we had wasters, we had a couple of wasters in there. I always thought that Rolf Fox really sort of took a holiday once he joined us because he was excellent at Norwich. And there's one player on the list that I do want to mention for personal reasons. I do have to give a shout out to Espen Bardson, who was, really important in that season where we stayed up. I mean, he had several, match-saving performances that really contributed to us staying up that season. And albeit he fell foul of he who should not be named for reasons that I should not be stating. But again, possibly another example of 90s Tottenham, a really good talent that we never managed to bring through in the right way.
So it's just like Espen, he was seen because of his nationality. He was going to be the next Eric Tortsvet. There was even an Espen the Viking child. And I remember one save he made against Bolton. It was a televised game, and it turned out to be a real six-pointer in that 97-98 year when we just stayed up. But he made an incredible save down in front of the Paxton Road end, down low to his left, which the camera caught perfectly. And you can see how significant that fingertip was.
I remember that, and I remember him a 0-0 draw at Highbury where they absolutely battered us. And I remember Thierry Henry saying that he thought it was the best goalkeeping performance he'd ever seen against them at that time. And I also remember him making this incredible double save against Blackburn, actually, which, I mean, he got the player of the match. It was a midweek game. He won 2-1, but he made an almost Banksian double, it was one of those double saves. It's just incredible. But that being said, we could probably all pick players, and the big T is coming up, and that's not the big T for Tottenham. It's the big T that says it is time to wrap things up with a final question, and that is, we're speaking about on the pitch here, okay? Best moment of the 90s and worst moment of the 90s. It's going to be tough. It's going to be ugly because there's many of each. But Gareth, you look like the man who can kick us off with that challenge. So there you go. Rise to it.
My best moment of the 90s. So I think the moment where I most wanted to walk out of my front door with my Spurs shirt on, it was the month from July the 30th until August the 31st, 1994. And I'm going to call this the Klinsmania period. So we signed Jurgen Klinsmann. And this was an incredible signing. I can't get over how much of a high profile signing this was. When we bought Klinsmann, I saw it on teletext just to give this some vintage as well. And those first few weeks, so when he first arrived in the country in his Beetle, once he totally put the press on their back foot by making reference to the fact that he dived in his opening press conference, to the fact that fans were locked out of a pre-season game at Watford because they wanted to see him, and then of course that goal on his debut at Hillsborough, and then the two goals that he scored against Everton 3 days later. And then we won at Ipswich at the end of the month. I've got a feeling he may not have scored, or maybe he only scored once in that game. But by all accounts, that was just breathtaking Spurs. And so that was the moment when probably I felt most proud until the Pochettino era to be a Spurs fan, was that almost calendar month of August 1994. As for the worst moment, I think it was, we could do a pod on worst moments of the 90s and get 3 hours out of it. I'm going to pick another week, actually. I'm going to pick the week of November 1996, and we had a horror week. So Wenger had just come in at Arsenal when we went and played them on a Sunday afternoon on a live televised game. And at that point, Jerry Francis had never lost a game to Arsenal. And this was really when the balance shifted. We lost 3-1 there. Tony Adams popped up with about 5 minutes to go and hit a volley from the edge of the area. And then Bergkamp scored a sort of typical Bergkamp worldie. And we felt very, very sorry for ourselves having lost there. 3 days later, we went to Bolton in the League Cup and got beaten 6-1. We got absolutely cuffed up at Burnden Park. And then we played Liverpool on the Monday night, was the following league. And we were really hoping for a big reaction in that game. And that was the game when McManaman hit this shot in front of the Park Lane end that bounced off the turf and bounced over Ian Walker's shoulder. And then the camera panned on Ian Walker, had this wry grin on his face as he looked up and watched the replay of it on the Jumbotron. And that was the moment where you really got the sense that, you know what, there's something really going on at Arsenal here at the moment. And we have, well, we've not even plateaued. We're on a downward trajectory. And my God, did we see that then materialise over the next couple of years or so? My
best moment would be the FA Cup semi-final in 1991, which we've talked about quite a few times before, so I won't dwell on it too much. But 3-1 win over those lot with the best free kick I've ever seen is a pretty good way to start the decade. And my worst, I'm going to go with 22nd of July 1995 Intertoto Cup, Cologne 8, Tottenham 0, with a scratch side pulled together because we didn't want to be in the competition in the first place.
Yeah.
I was looking at the lineup earlier on today on that. So Chris Day, Stephen Carr, Owen Cole, Mark Newsom, Jamie Clapham, David Byrne, not that one, Alan Pardew, Simon Spencer, Andy Turner, Kevin Watson, Steve Slade. 8-0.
That's a bad one.
A record defeat.
Yes, I'm going to be very specific. Actually, you know that the semi-final, of course, was big. I wasn't there, so I enjoyed it from afar, as I've talked about before on a video on a tour bus with Napalm Death about a week later. I mean, for me, my favourite moment of the 90s that I witnessed, that I was there, was that quarter-final against Liverpool at Anfield. I just, the energy that came from that equaliser, the football we played that day was really good. We were worthy. We were worth our win. And of course, a last-minute winner from Jurgen Klinsmann in front of the Kop. You know, you're not going to get much better than that. And the Scousers gave us a round of applause at the end. And I have to say, to a person outside the ground, Liverpool supporters were really great. They were really like, you know, good on your lad and so on and so forth. So a really brilliant feeling. And I really, really felt that we were going to win the Cup that year. And so it would almost be poetic if I was to tell you that my worst moment of the 90s was then that 4-1 defeat at Elland Road, which was disastrous and terrible, but it wasn't. I think my worst memory, and my God, there have been a few, sadly, there really have been, especially, but, you know, the Francis ones, they kind of merge into a big sort of pile of sludge into the gross, and then he who should not be named, I don't know, it becomes too amorphous to break down. The one I can break down for you is when we lost 1-0 to Coventry in April of 1994. Significant to me because Kurt Cobain had sadly taken his own life several days earlier. So I was already on a downer for that. And then not only did we lose a vital game in our fight for survival that season, but it was to a Kevin Scott own goal. I mean, you know, my friends and I got abused by a 9-year-old Coventry supporter outside the ground. I mean, it was just about the shittiest away day experience you can imagine. And I remember leaving the ground thinking, my God, we might actually get stuffed. We might go down. And if I remember correctly, and I know Gareth will correct me here, it was only when we went up to Oldham, I think, was it 2 weeks later? We went up to Oldham and the much maligned Vinnie Samways, a player we haven't even touched on, actually, who was also emblematic of these, scored 2 goals up at Oldham, you know?
Vinnie Samways and David Howells scored that night up at Oldham.
There we go. I remember that. So that was my worst moment. And I'm going to wedge this in. I'm going off script. Milo's going to reach through the screen and punch me. That's fine. I don't care. We can't mention the 90s without mentioning Naeem. What's wrong with us? Who the hell are we? Who the hell are we? Naeem provided probably one of the greatest moments of the 90s, and it wasn't in our shirt.
It was the best Spurs goal of the decade, wasn't it?
It was the best Spurs goal of the decade, you know, and thus it gave us that great song, Naeem from the halfway line, and it gave us those horrible puns, you know, the Naeem can lob Seaman from 50 yards and all that kind of childish stuff, which I freely engaged in my, at that time. And you know, so I mean, a shame on us, actually. It's not in our notes at all, and I'm really glad I remembered it. So pat on the back to your moderator, because let's be fair, or your host, I should say, can't forget him.
Well, he was a real cult hero, wasn't he? And I remember him scoring a goal at home to Norwich on Easter Monday. It would have been the 92-93 season. He squeezed one in from a really tight angle. And of course, Naeem was the player who came on for Gascoigne in the 91 FA Cup final as well. He certainly played a part in the equalising goal that we scored. So, genuinely a real cult hero of a player.
I just wanted to give a nod to Stephen Carr's goal against Man United at home. It's 1999, wasn't it? Was it 3-1?
23rd of October, yeah.
3-1 Man United, yeah.
What a goal.
That's it. I mean, I've got a story about that game as well, if you just indulge me for a minute. But Pete Abbott, who's Spurs announcer, who I'm friends with, and Pete won't mind me telling this story. So Pete's the one who gives you the team lineups. He used to introduce Paul Coyte onto the pitch and tell you the goal scorers. Anyway, if you watch footage of that game, so Stephen Carr scores that screamer. If you watch the video back of that game and you listen in, you'll hear Pete saying, "Third goal for Spurs scored by number 7, Rule Fox." Now, if ever there was a player who looked least like Stephen Carr, it's probably Rule Fox. And we still give Pete a good ribbon for this now. But, he will tell you that he was just happened to be, the ball was on the halfway line and he was looking down at his notes or looking at something. And then he hears this huge roar and the ball goes in and he just panics. And I don't know why he thought it was Rule Fox, but he did. But, it definitely was Stephen Carr. The independent panel from the Premier League did have a look at that one. They could confirm it wasn't Rule Fox.
And all of this, and I didn't even get into my absolute joy the night we beat Nottingham Forest 3-1 with Jukebox Jury scoring and Gary Lineker in the same night as a strike partnership. And what it tells you is that the much maligned 90s are actually a font of entertainment, memories, peaks, valleys, and probably everything that football is all about. It is about these moments. It's about these absurd memories and great ones and the tragedies and and all of the good and bad stuff. And we're just proving that the 90s is stuffed full of them. And I'll say this now. I think that somewhere down the line we might want to revisit this decade because it's quite obvious that there's an awful lot more to dive into and discuss, and maybe we'll have a couple of the other chaps on. Spurs
in the 90s Part 1, this is what this is.
It really is. And what I've learned as we've been talking about this is that, we started off with quite, a doldromic view of things, if you will. And, this was meant to be a fairly tight record. And here we are by the end of it. And, we went an hour or so without even mentioning Naeem. I mean, there's so much to get into. And it really was an entertaining time.
I think, if you look at the decade, as we said, we've got some really, really fantastic players there. And when those players hit form, they were completely unplayable. And there's also long periods of absolute dross. So the high points are really high because you really had to sludge through it to get to them. I remember when Joel was manager and going to games with friends, and one of my friends saying to me, "I'm not enjoying it anymore. I go to the game expecting us to win. It's completely different. It's not what I'm used to." What he was used to was the 90s and going to the games with low expectations and being pleasantly surprised occasionally.
Oh, it's so good you said that.
I think the other thing, just to make everyone aware of, is the macro climate, that the 90s is a fantastic decade of nostalgia for football generally. And there's lots of very good podcasts that are out there that focus just on the 90s. But Spurs are no different, that if you look at the way that football as a business and as a game evolved during the decade, that if you think about some of the things we've spoken about that were occurring in the very start of the decade, it's almost amateurish that it took the Premier League. And look, we've got a very, very polished product now that you almost take for granted, but the 90s was that transitional period from absolute chaos and games being called off because of no undersoil heating working on Boxing Day at the start of the decade, and players turning up at club shops and just sticking a load of merchandise in the back of the car. That was a training ground that you hired off the local council, which Spurs did in Mill Hill. That was totally indicative of where football was as the top tier of the professional game at the start of the decade. And you could see as the decade progressed here that we were moving towards this more professional, slick machine that we now enjoy.
I'm going to have the last word here because you've absolutely just stimulated this memory. This will be the last word. It absolutely will be. But nothing says 90s Tottenham more than me at Filbert Street, the old Filbert Street. We're 1-0 down to a shitty Leicester. We're a shitty Tottenham at that time. and Teddy scores an equaliser in like the 93rd minute, and we celebrated like we'd won the fucking league. I remember running from the back of the away corner to the front. And that was a night where it was, the Who Ate All the Pies was being sung at fat blokes with their shirts off. I mean, there was no reason for that game to be exciting in any way whatsoever, but still, to this day, I remember the unbridled joy of that equaliser, which meant absolutely bugger all in the context of anything. But what a night. That, my friends, is Spurs of the 90s Part 1. What a great conversation. And Milo, I don't envy you. I'm sorry, but sometimes it has to happen this way. So anyway, from the joys of the 90s to next weekend and the continuation of the Antonio Conte era. More ear-sniffing comfort from the great man, I hope. Progressive ear-sniffing comfort, I should say. We welcome Leeds United to White Hart Lane. It's going to be a fascinating contest because it is Conte versus Bielsa. And it will be interesting to see what a couple of weeks on the training ground with Antonio has done for our players not on international duty, most of whom it looks like are going to have hearing damage if the pictures of Antonio from the training ground are anything to go by. They'll certainly be a lot fitter, and there'll be a condiment-free selection of professionals, we should think, for the game, right? So
do you think the game's going to be saucy then to you, Steff?
Oh, very good. Very good. He's chipping away for humour there. He's got it there. Very good. Actually, in fairness, I think it might not be saucy more than it will be spicy, because we do know that, Leeds play with full commitment. Bielsa's a fully committed manager, likes to fly forward, likes to attack. And of course, Antonio, well, I don't know. For me, he can do no wrong right now because I'm just hopelessly in love again. So, counterbalance that with some common sense analysis of the forthcoming game against.
So I'm slightly stuck in the 90s time warp now, and I'm just trying to work out how Colin Caldwell's going to keep Tony Yeboah quiet for 90 minutes.
Well, the answer to that question is he's not. How's that?
Probably about right. Look, I think there's lots of variables. It's the back end of an international break. You never quite know how all the players are going to come back. We know Conte's been working very hard on the players that have been coming back. I think the reality is it's going to take a while, maybe weeks rather than months, until we start to see Conte Spurs as he wants to see him. I think it'll be a fairly tight 2-1 win, because I think that's the sensible way to play at the moment, is just to keep the handbrake on a little bit. Albeit Skip's not going to play, is he? So probably that means Lo Celso and Dembele playing alongside Højbjerg.
Or Winksy.
Winks would be the more conservative pick, wouldn't it? But
the rumours are that he's going to switch to a 3-4-1-2 with Ndombele as the one, which I think probably means you're looking at Lo Celso or Winks alongside Højbjerg. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw Højbjerg and Winks with Ndombele and then Son and Kane up top.
Yeah, so he's not really giving away any trade secrets with Bielsa. He'll have a helicopter or hot air balloon flying over Hotspur Way, won't he, over the week, observing and seeing what's going on.
He tends to line up the opposite, so he doesn't tend to match up sides, so I'd expect him probably to play 4 at the back, which will be interesting.
Leeds look like a team in that sort of cliched second season up, so they won a lot of plaudits last year, and they appear to have plateaued this year. Yeah,
and I think Bielsa's sides tend to run out of steam, don't they? But they tire of his methods after a while. He's had a good run there. I just wonder whether this is kind of the beginning of the end for him there.
One thing's for sure, it will be a good game. We are going to get space to get to attack. We are going to be given opportunities for sure, because that's the way Leeds are. That's the way those games happen. So it's going to be good. I'm excited. I think it's going to go well. But there again, as we've established, I'm a hopeless romantic. So what else would I think? And with that, chaps, I think we've come to the end, albeit we could probably all witter on about Calderwood, Nethercutt and the like forever. Well, maybe not forever, but for at least another hour. But anyway, thanks very much, guys. It was really fun to somewhat realise that the 90s were they were okay. Are you at this point, Milo? Are you a little less? Surely you must have warmed up a little bit from shit to mildly uncomfortable at times.
There were games I enjoyed. It's just overall it was shit.
Hang on, let's say that again, but without the last half of the sentence.
What, there were games I enjoyed? Of course there were games
There we go.
I enjoyed.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. Thank you, guys. Optimism reigns supreme on The Game Is About Glory. Thanks, Milo. Thanks, Gareth. And next week, we'll be back to discuss said 21st century football and said game against Leeds United. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram, so give us a follow, say hello. And if you like the pod, which of course you do because you're listening, just tell even more of your friends than you've already told and help us keep growing. And my word, we are growing, and it's thanks to people like you. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.